We'd been out on the lakes for a couple of days, and we were absolutely having a blast. We were doing a canoe trip in northern BC, a place called the Bowron Lakes. People from all over the world come to the Bowron Lakes to paddle there. And it was beautiful. Beautiful scenery, the mountains, the wildlife, the water, everything was perfect. But there was one day we were on the largest lake, Lake Isaac, and something changed. First, it went quiet. Saying it was quiet isn't quite right. It wasn't that there was no sounds. It was that all of a sudden we could hear sounds that were too far away to hear. We could hear a paddle dipping into the lake, across the lake. We could hear leaves on the trees rustling. It was very strange to be able to hear all of this all at once. And then it got dark, really fast. It wasn't that the clouds were rolling in, it was the clouds were just forming out of nothing above us, blotting out the sun. And Jen and I knew that we had to move very quickly. We put the paddles into high gear, and we raced for the shore. We rammed the shore at full speed, and then the two of us quickly took everything out of the canoe so that we could turn the canoe up over top of our stuff to keep it dry and keep it in place. And we had done that just in time that the rain and the wind started. And it was a downpour. All of a sudden, that beautiful glassy sea turned into raging chaos. Now, we really weren't in any danger. Jen and I know how to camp. We know how to keep ourselves safe. We know that we need to stay close to shore so that if trouble does come, we can get to safety quickly. And from then on, we just started pulling over at lunch because we found out that on the Bowron Lakes, every day around lunchtime, a big squall comes up. So we just took a break. But now imagine what it would have been like, that you're not on a lake in northern BC, but in a big sea in the Middle East, on the Galilee. And you're not in a canoe, but you're in a fishing boat with your friends. And you're not close to shore because the wind has carried you way off into the middle. That would be terrifying. And now imagine that when you look out into the distance onto the sea, you see somebody else out there, but they're not in a boat. Thankfully, they're not drowning. They seem to be out for a stroll. This story is from Matthew 14. Immediately, he made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up to the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking towards them on the lake. But when the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why do you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." This is a pretty familiar story. I'm sure even those who aren't really all that churchy have some basic knowledge. The whole idea of walking on water has become a popular trope to describe someone who has exceptional skill or goodness. And so, being so familiar, you might have an idea in your head already as to how this story is playing out, a picture of the scene. But when I picture the scene, it is admittedly unbiblical. I kind of see, in my mind, there's the disciples, and they're sitting in the boat with their fishing rods, and they're just having a nice chat, and Jesus comes just walking on by. The Bible story, though, is far more dramatic. The Bible story is saying that this is actually in the middle of a storm. And it's very, very early in the morning, so it's quite likely it's still dark. And so they can't really see Jesus. And there's a reason for this, because there's big waves. Jesus is probably going up and down. There he is. There he is. And then even when he's up above the waves, there's splashing and there's mist and it's dark and they can't really see all that clearly, and so they assume it's a ghost. And what else would it be? It's the middle of the water. Nobody's walking there. And then there's also all of the superstitions that went with storms. Because remember, these are pre-scientific people. When a storm blows up, it isn't a meteorological event, it's a supernatural one. But then, all of a sudden, this ghost calls out and says, "Don't be afraid, it's me. Everything's going to be okay." And then there's Peter. Wonderful, enthusiastic Peter. If you were watching a movie, Peter would be the lovable doofus that is the comedic element of the movie, the one that always kind of gets things wrong, but everybody just loves him. That's who he is. And he says, "Hey, if that's you, Jesus, call me out onto the water and have me come to you." And so Jesus says, "Come." And Peter hops out of the boat, and he's walking on the water. He's doing it. This is exciting. And I don't know if you've ever had one of those times when you're doing something really miraculous and all of a sudden you realize, wait, I can't do this. And then you can't, because you've just decided in your head that you can't. And he starts to sink. Now, this is the part of the sermon where most of the time you're going to hear the message, "Don't be like Peter." That lack of faith person. My goodness, if you only had just a little bit of faith. But let's give Peter a break. You ever tried walking on water? It's not easy. I've been practicing. And to kind of ease my way into it, I've started by walking on frozen water. And I'll tell you, even that's hard. One misstep and you're flat on your back. I should be wearing my helmet all winter long. So let's just give him a little bit of slack here. Also, you have to ask the question, how many people in that boat actually had the faith to jump out of the boat in the first place? By my count, it's one. It's just Peter. And then that little bit of faith that Jesus says, well, all through Matthew's gospel, Jesus is actually praising small doses of faith. He says that if you just had a little bit of faith, you could move mountains. And that's what he says that Peter has. A little faith. All he needs. So why on earth would you doubt? Peter is the one that does something impossible. Peter is the one that Jesus will eventually call to lead his new church. There may be a reason for that, because Peter is the one who is foolish enough to think that the impossible becomes possible in the presence of Christ. But for you, What is your equivalent to walking on water? What is completely ridiculously impossible for you that maybe isn't? Maybe there is something that you've always wanted to do in your life, but you've just decided that's not for me. Maybe it's penning that great Canadian novel. Maybe it's the trip that you just don't think you can do. Well, maybe, but maybe you can. What about the failed relationships? The person you haven't talked to, the person who you'd love to find reconciliation with, but you just think it's too late? Well, maybe it's not. Maybe there's a grudge or a wound on your soul that has been there for so long that has actually started to define who you are as a person. A weight that you carry day after day after day. And sometimes maybe you kind of forget why it was there in the first place. Maybe it's time to forgive. Forgive others and forgive yourself. Do the impossible. And what about our church? Do you think maybe our church should take the chance of jumping over the side of the boat on occasion? You know, one of the things that we hear all the time is that mainline churches in Canada are all doomed. We're all closing. And we have told ourselves that narrative so often that I think sometimes we just take it for granted. That it is the only possibility for our future, that our churches are all just gonna close down. Really? Does that have to be the case? Sure, churches close all the time, but some don't. Some grow, some thrive. But I'll tell you, the churches that do well tend to be the churches that risk getting their feet wet, that risk hopping over the side of the gunnels to see what's on the water. Sometimes it is taking the risk. Sometimes it's doing things, operating in a new way. The people right here know this. Maybe sometimes it helps to amalgamate some of our congregations. Sometimes it helps to share clergy, not only with other churches, but maybe even with other denominations. We all claim to follow the one God. Maybe this is a path that we can lead. And what about our whole world? Maybe our whole world needs to take the chance of sinking once in a while, because the whole world is waiting for a transformation from a world economy that is based on desperation and environmental destruction. Maybe instead we can transform the world economy into something that is sustainable and takes care of the least of these. Maybe we can move our world into one that is ruled by love and justice and kindness rather than greed and war. Would any of this be easy? Of course not. No one would ever claim that this is easy. But remember what I said about that scene with the boat? They're in the middle of a storm. And if it was me, I would have said to Jesus first, I wouldn't have asked if I can come out and walk on the water with him. I would have said, could you take care of this whole storm? You've done it before. But that's not what Peter asked, and that's not what Jesus offered. Jesus called Peter to come out into the storm with him, into the chaos, to skip across the crests of the waves. A completely difficult task. And then he started to sink. And of course he did, because he wasn't quite ready. And so when Jesus calls us out into the chaos of our lives, of our churches, of our world, should we not also expect, at least on the first time, yeah, we're going to sink too. We're gonna make mistakes. We're going to find out that maybe this wasn't such a great idea, at least this time. We so often get so caught up on this idea that everything that we do has to be successful. Well, forget that. If you do that, you're going to just keep staying in the boat. Because remember, this story is not a story that ends with, don't be like Peter. This is a story that says very much, be like Peter. Take the risks. You might get your feet wet. You might start to sink. But have faith. Because Peter had the faith to jump out, but then Peter had the faith when he knew he was in trouble to reach out his hand to Jesus who was going to save him. So when we are hopping out of the comfort of our deck chairs to walk on the storms, to be in the chaos of our world, we gotta expect that we too are gonna fail. We may speak truth to power that does not want to hear truth, and we might get backlash. We might try and transform a world while many, many people find war and hate to be very profitable. And they're going to have something to say to us. Maybe even just little tiny tweaks and transformations of our own congregations might not work. We might lose people. We might have to try again. We might start sinking below the surface. But at least we got out of the comfort of our deck chairs to give it a try, and Jesus will be there with us in the storm. Be like Peter. Have faith. Jesus is with us. Jesus is always going to be holding out his hand, calling us, then again holding out his hand to save us when we inevitably get it wrong. But even getting it wrong is a celebration of faith.